looking back at the clock there, folks, and I'm just going to warn you, we're going to run a little bit over today. I hope that's all right with you. There's something a little later on that you will not want to miss. But in the meantime, we're continuing and actually starting to wrap up our Easter series that's based on this book here called The Last Week by Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan. It chronicles the events that took place in Jerusalem, starting on Palm Sunday and ending with the events of Easter Sunday. When we last left Jesus in the city of Jerusalem, he had just made what is called the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And what we learned last week was that it was actually a carefully planned counter demonstration designed to play off the fact that there was going to be a Roman military procession that was bringing Pontius Pilate into Jerusalem for the Passover festival. A counterpoint to that military festival. It gave people something to cheer about, a reason to hope. And then, right after the big parade, Jesus started planning his next move. Everything planned carefully in advance. Here's what happened. After he entered Jerusalem, he went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Something's up. Jesus is casing the joint. He's scoping out the scene of his next demonstration, but it's too late in the afternoon. Not enough people around. Best to wait till the next morning when the place would be teeming with people who were coming there for the big Passover festival. So, he goes back next morning, and sure enough, there are hundreds of people all around, and that is the famous scene. You're all familiar with this. That's where he throws the money changers out of the temple, turns over tables, and he says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers," or a den of thieves, as it's sometimes called. And when the chief priests and scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. Isn't it interesting? They call this teaching. This is the rhetorical equivalent of pounding your fist on the podium to make a point. He's knocking things around and making a lot of noise. No mass destruction. He didn't bring down the empire. All he manages to do is to disrupt the temple business for a couple of hours. But the most important thing is that he becomes the center of attention, and he creates what is really a teachable moment. They got it right. And often this incident is portrayed as Jesus condemning the rituals of the Jewish religion, but that's not quite it. Jesus had nothing against spiritual and religious rituals so long as those things were serving their intended purpose, which was to bring the people together and offer them empowerment, encouragement, support, and justice. Those are the kind of things that we look to our spiritual practices for. One of the consistent messages that Jesus had was that spiritual practices should serve the people and not the other way around. But that wasn't happening anymore in the temple. The temple had sold out. It had become just another facet of Roman domination. That was the place where they collected the taxes that were paid as tribute to Rome after, of course, Herod and the priests got their cut. Jesus is exposing and highlighting some serious corruption, some serious hypocrisy. And we know that his teachable moment got through, that the message got through because the chief priests and the scribes, it says in the story, they were afraid of him. It says that the crowd was spellbound. So this is what you might call a throwdown. This is what you might call a throwdown, and that was it. That's all that he needed to accomplish for Monday. He's already set the stage for the very next day, so he heads back to Bethany where he's been staying. But he just shut down the temple. Can you imagine how this story was spreading through the city like wildfire? For those who hadn't observed it, people are talking about this. You think maybe some more folks are going to show up the next day to see what might happen then? Do you see how this is all building one thing on another, carefully planned out in advance? So the next day, Jesus comes back to Jerusalem, heads straight back to the temple, the scene of the crime. And there, the chief priests and the scribes are waiting for him. And they're going to confront him, and here's the exchange. They say, "By whose authority did you drive out the merchants from the temple? Who gave you such authority?" And Jesus says, "I'll tell you who gave me authority to do these things if you answer one question." Turns the tables. "Did John's baptism come from heaven, or was it merely human? Answer me." They talk it over among themselves. And they're saying to themselves, well, gosh, if we say that it was from heaven, then he will ask why we didn't believe him. Eventually John the Baptist was executed. He was killed. But do we dare say that it was merely human? For they were afraid that the people would start a riot, since everyone thought that John was a prophet. So they finally replied, "I don't know." "We don't know." And Jesus responded, "Then I won't answer your question either." Brilliant. Brilliant. He sets it up perfectly. The priests and the scribes would either have to admit that John was a legitimate prophet or denounce him in front of the home crowd who thought that John was the real deal. And the people, they had to be loving this because they're seeing these people that represented the hierarchy, the dominator system, really getting, really being exposed. Finally, they see Jesus, someone who's willing to stand up and expose them for the collaborators and the cowards that they really were. I don't know. I mean, what a weasel! What a way to weasel out of a debate, right? So, again, we hear about how the chief priests and the scribes would just love to have him arrested and killed. In fact, you can find there are at least 3 different stories just in the Gospel of Mark alone where we hear about how these authorities wanted to have him arrested and have him killed, but they hold back because in each instance it says that they are afraid of the people. They're afraid of the people. The powerful in a dominator system like this, the collaborators, they're always afraid of the people. They're afraid of the people being well-informed, inspired. They're afraid of the people learning how to think for themselves. And none of this was news to Jesus. He knew perfectly well how the authorities would react to his presence, his message, and his demonstrations. Even his followers knew that Jerusalem was a very dangerous place for all of them. I mean, going there was like walking into the lion's den. Absolute power, as demonstrated by Rome and their collaborators, absolute power is one of the most dangerous and corrupting forces on the planet. And it's not just the Romans. It happens over and over and over again, even in our religious institutions. Think of the Crusades, the Inquisition, the witch trials in the American colonies. Power combined with ignorance and fear can make human beings do things that we very appropriately call evil. And Jesus had this deep, deep knowledge of human nature. He knew what was likely to happen to him. And he went anyway. And the question I have is why? Why did Jesus decide to go and look death in the eye, so to speak, tempt fate? Well, the answer that I always got from Orthodox Christianity is that it was the will of God. The Orthodox view is that Jesus had to die. Jesus had to die because God was so deeply offended and dishonored by human sinfulness that no amount of finite human punishment could make up for it. So God demands that his own infinite and divine Son accept torture and death as punishment in our place. The Orthodox view says that human beings deserve the same kind of torture and punishment and death and even worse things because we're so miserable, sinful, and depraved. And then they offer the solution. If you want to avoid that kind of torture, punishment, and death, all you have to do is believe what we tell you to believe about Jesus. Do you see what happens? With that, we have another power play. Another domination system claiming absolute power that insists that people relinquish the right to think for themselves about these events. Our message here is that each of us has the absolute, and I would say God-given right to determine what these events mean. And I'm not here to tell you what that is. My purpose is to guide, to educate, fill in the backstory, offer alternatives. So, a short summary of what's been going on during the last week. A real short summary. Jesus enters Jerusalem. The people give him a hero's welcome. He does these demonstrations that gain further support of the people. 5 days later, he's dead. Another one of the many victims of the ruthless Roman Empire. Palm Sunday, 5 days later, he's dead. 300 years later, the religion that was based on the teachings of Jesus became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And in another 160 years, the Roman Empire disappeared. And even then, people all around the world continued to find something inspiring, something meaningful in the life and the message of this rebellious rabbi from Galilee. We don't hear that part of the story in the Bible, do we? And yet it's just as important a part of the story because the story is still unfolding today. People can quibble, and they do quibble, over the discrepancies and the inconsistencies and the gospel stories about Easter and what really happened. And when they do that, they miss this deeper meaning. They stay stuck, they stay focused, and they miss the whole rest of the story. People can argue all they want about what actually happened on Easter Sunday. You can argue all you want, big dispute about that, but there's no dispute about what happened later. We've seen it. In their book, The Last Week, Crossan and Borg, they talk about the Easter stories in the Gospels, and I really love this invitation that they give to us. They say, believe whatever you want about whether the stories happened this way. Now let's talk about what they mean. If you believe the tomb was empty, fine. Now, what does the story mean? If you believe that Jesus' appearances could have been videotaped, fine. Now, what do these stories mean? And if you're not sure about that, or even if you are quite sure that it didn't happen this way, fine. Now, what do these stories mean? There's no definitive answer to this question. Each Easter here at Unity of Auburn, we explore a different alternative. This is one possibility. What we see after Good Friday, we see the followers of Jesus going into hiding. They're terrified. They're defeated. They're demoralized. All of their hopes and expectations had been dashed. Things didn't turn out the way they thought. You might say they went underground for a while, which is an appropriate way of looking at it because they were literally in their own kind of a tomb, hiding, withdrawn from the world. A couple of things could have happened. They might have disbanded. They might have just been discouraged and said, hey, let's forget about all this stuff and go back to what we were doing before, back to fishing or whatever it was. Or they might have stayed underground. And then they could have plotted revenge against the Romans and the Jewish authorities. Political assassinations, guerrilla warfare, acts of sabotage. Could have done that. But instead, they did something completely different. After a time, within a couple of months, they had their own resurrection experience. They left the tomb of their own defeat, fear, victimhood, whatever you call it. They left the tomb and they walked into the light of courage and compassion. Jesus got through to them after all. No running away, no lashing out. They were transformed. There was something in them that had been crucified and raised back into the light along with their teacher. So his followers embark on this mission, this journey of reaching out to the marginalized, healing the sick, feeding the hungry, and welcoming everyone into this new community that they were forming. So one possibility is to look at Easter as a major point in human consciousness, an alternative to the domination systems of the world that try to tell us that we should conform, go along to get along, stop thinking for ourselves, and never ever question authority. I think Jesus would disagree. And he was willing to give up his own life to get his message across. And the message is that truth, integrity, compassion, courage, love, they're more powerful than death. You can kill the human being named Jesus, but you can't kill the Christ, which is the state of consciousness that is the source of these kind of enlightened ideas. Now that's the kind of immortality that doesn't require a supernatural explanation. So the events of Easter, they're not a done deal. The story continues to unfold, and it's the story of what we, each of us, are doing. What are we doing with these enlightened ideas that were so powerful and so important that this rabbi from Galilee was willing to face death in order to give them to us, to demonstrate them? As we said at the top of the service, crucifixion and resurrection mean transformation. So the question we go away with today is, what is it in us that needs to be transformed so that we can take part in what is really a great story? A great story where we're living those Christ ideas in some way that's going to transform the world, because that's our mission and that's our vision. And this is a poignant reminder of that. So just another Easter alternative submitted for your consideration and inspiration. And happy Easter, everyone.